Hey everyone, welcome to another On This Day in Canadian Military History live stream. Today is going to be a little different, as in terms of just me and doing a book review. So today's book review is going to be on this one. It's a fairly new book, just released in November, I believe, mid-November, if I'm remembering correctly. So thanks to Heritage House for sending it to me. Appreciate it, and appreciate being included in the loop and being thought of for these kinds of things. So this is the second one that they've sent me about Bomber Command and the Canadian contribution to it. So it's something I've been doing a lot of reading about recently and a lot of thinking about. So it's oh, hi Lorelai, thank you for that. So it's excuse me, it's a little bit of a trend going here for me, an unintended one, but one I'm really enjoying in a new area for me in a lot of ways, and getting down into the personal stories. So the other one, and you can watch the review after as well, is on this one. I did that one quite a while ago, but the books are a little differently. So this one is the first one they sent me. So again, appreciative of that. So it's really, it was an interesting read. I really enjoyed it, just to say that off the beginning. It was a very interesting one in terms of the stories that were covered. A lot more were covered in this one than were covered in For Who Dared. So, of course, the four stories. This one has a total of 13, I believe, covered. Hold on, just let me check my notes here. Where'd it go? 16, sorry. So 16 individual stories were covered in Failed to Return. So it covers a lot of depth and a lot of characters and a lot of individuals who served, Canadians and others as well. So there's stories that Brits covered. There's an Australian covered, I believe. There's connections to New Zealand, also to Britain, obviously, things going on in North Africa and the bombing connected to Sicily and Italy. So it's got quite a bit of depth of Canada's involvement and the RCAF, its involvement in Bomber Command. So it's a really good part of it that I very much enjoyed. Sorry, I'm just going to try and keep up with the comments. Hey, Philip, thanks for joining us. And Alex, thanks for coming on. Yeah, so I agree. Philip says here that personal stories are good. It's something I don't do too much of, or recently haven't done too much of, because of my academic background. So it's really nice to get into something a little different with this one. So again, that's something I've really wanted to highlight there. It's not an academic book. Again, just like with For Who Dared, I mentioned that last time. It's not academic. It's not his intended audience. It's just to share the stories, which is something I do personally, right? So those of you who know the channel know that. And it's something that I really like to see in as many formats as possible. So this one is just an interesting aside more than anything. I think this is the first book I've read that was written during COVID, which is just something different, right? Because we all know what that means in terms of lockdowns and access to travel and documentation and everything. So it's quite interesting. I think a lot of this book was done earlier, but excuse me, that this is an interesting element of it, because there's a part in here, and one of the most interesting stories in here, to me at least, is a new edition and hasn't really been talked about before, which is rather unfortunate. But yeah, so it's a really interesting one. So it's part of it. It's just more of an aside than anything, but it's still something really cool to keep in mind. So the title of the book, and this came up a couple when I first posted about it on Twitter, is that it's called Failed to Return. So, and as it explains in the book, what that means is that these are the crews and their planes didn't come back from, the nightly bombing runs that Bomber Command did over Europe. But what that doesn't mean, though, is necessarily that the entire crew was killed, right? There's POWs. There's a few stories of that in here. And, well, there's one, I believe, in this one or two, if I'm remembering correctly, that is evade capture completely. With the help of local resistance groups, some good luck, a lot of personal courage, that kind of thing. So it's really interesting. And again, sorry, got distracted there a bit. What was I going to say? Yeah, so I don't want to give away like the last time I reviewed a Bomber Command book that's on the stories of it and everything. I don't want to give them all away, but I'm just going to talk about a few of them and then some kind of like general impressions and things like that, and a few asides as well. And of course, if you have questions, please do ask at any time, and then I will I'll answer them as best I can. And you can have just general questions about Bomber Command as well. I'm more than happy to answer those. And what I know is best, I know we have some people watching who know this stuff, so we can get some stuff going on the side chat too. This probably won't be an hour, just because it's not a very long book, and I don't want to give a good chunk of it away, because again, the stories are just amazing to be read, and to, from what the authors have done, it's something I highly suggest you go out and get. With that said, there are links below that do help me if I get a little bit of a commission. Sorry, there's no British link. I don't have one. I have one for Canada for both a paperback and an ebook, and then one for the US through an organization, Bookshop, that does sales through independent bookstores. I don't know if it'll be in time for Christmas at this point, but it is still just worth getting, even if it's just for yourself. So that's something to keep in mind. So what I want to kind of start off with is the introduction of this one. It outlines, I think, quite fairly well, and hits the big ones, the major themes that connect to the RCAF and Bomber Command in the Second World War. So you have things like the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which I've said on many occasions, I think is Canada's greatest contribution to the Allied victory of the Second World War. I say that both from a perspective of, I don't think another nation could have fulfilled this role as well as Canada did, or kind of even having the political will to do so. But also it was just factually one of the most important parts of the war that Canada contributed to the most, right? Canada pays for most of it. The bases are throughout Canada. It's bringing pilots from Australia, New Zealand, Britain. The South Africans get involved at some point, I believe, as well. And they're coming from all different parts of the British Empire as well. I posted a while back about a pilot originally from what is now Sri Lanka, and then enlisted in Singapore, and then did his initial training in Canada. So that's just showing how these things are connected and how people moved throughout the world at this point. So that's a really interesting part of this, is keeping that in mind, because the stories in here are in a rough chronological order. So they talk about, there's stories that they use as examples of things that happen. So like the training units, there's a story about a crew who crashes on a training flight in Britain. It comes down in, I believe, Scotland somewhere, and how none of them survived the crash. And there's a lot of that in here. And of course, this is a lot of sad stories, because it's, again, failure to return, right? They don't come back from the raids. So a few of them come back later, but most of them are unfortunately killed. And again, like any other time we've talked about Bomber Command, or excuse me, the RCAF in general, they're really, really young. I mean, some of the stories in here, it's heartbreaking. I mean, some of them are 19, 18 years old. In this one particular, it's really, really sad. No other ways to put about it here. The stories and all of that is part of this. So going past that, another important part that's talked about in here very briefly, but I think that's fine for the understanding the context, because again, this isn't an academic text. There are other places to find that, is the Canadianization of Bomber Command and Canadian units. So that term is a bit missing the mark. I don't know how to say a best way that Canadianization is kind of like a catch-all. So in terms of what that means, I guess as a quick little aside, is initially Canadians, like the rest of the Dominions, aviators and those from the British Empire, would just join RAF squadrons in Bomber Command. Eventually that changes. They become RCAF squadrons. And then there's even a RCAF commanded group, bomber group, number 6, which becomes RCAF. And that's mentioned throughout. And what that means, the political stuff is talked about a little bit. Again, not the focus of this book, but if you don't know hardly anything, it's enough to keep you grounded and hopefully make you want to look at more, because I think that's a good thing about this book too that I really, really enjoyed. And even there's parts where I had to, put it down and quickly look at something again, or look at a location, or see how it connects in everything. It's a really interesting. It's an interesting part of that, and I think it just leads to another one. So yeah, we got another question already, and that's a good one from a good supporter of the show, Sheldrake 6. That's a good question, and that's a tough one. I think so. I mean, I might get some flack from a certain viewer today. Alex, I don't know his opinions on this, to be honest, but I know he and I have discussed air power a lot, and that's one of his specialties. I think it was in terms of how it broke up crews, because again, for some of you who don't know, a lot of these crews weren't just from one country, right? Like I said, Canadians were put in, right? You'd have Brits, um, Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians all could be mixed in within one plane, right? And a lot of them had served together. There's the policy that they only do 30 missions and then they get transferred to somewhere else. They could go back into combat, but you have to volunteer to be part of aircrew. So it's an interesting part of this. So a lot of that camaraderie and connection could be lost if you're focusing on just one nationality. There is the financial aspect to that as well, because why Canadianization happens is because the Canadian government is paying for it, right? They'll pay for these Canadian squadrons, which of course Britain, who is very much cash strapped during the entire war, and when I mean cash strapped, I mean even in US dollars, right? So this is an important part which Canada can provide, right? If it can provide some relief, especially because Canada couldn't get a hold of US dollars easier than Britain at this point, it's something to remember. Yeah, and I mean, this is another, and there's Alex, who I mentioned, is making a very good point. It's about efficiency, right? But also that's debunked because number 6 does very well in terms of missions and everything. It helps, does a job just as well, I think, as anything else. And just more insight from Alex, which I was expecting because we have the delay a little bit, so it takes a bit for it to come in. But this is why I like doing these things live, because we get others' insights just about the topic we're talking about, or what have you. Yeah, so here's another one, just giving lots of good knowledge here, which is amazing. So what else did I want to talk about next? That's the main parts of the introduction. They talk about how they're going to take a personal angle. A lot of the research is spectacular in terms of this. Like, they're in touch of who's left of the families. They get documents that probably you wouldn't see otherwise. They're in touch with all kinds of museums and organizations and understanding how to get this stuff, right? Because especially for some families, it's still painful, right? These losses. I mean, most of that generation, as we all know, has passed or is passing. But people still can have these things that can still hurt. So getting and telling these stories it's a grateful thing, just as a reader, that they're willing to share, and then these authors are able to bring it together for us. I think that's really good. Oh, I don't know if I said this before, but I'll just say it quickly again. It's not one author. It's edited by Keith Ogilvie, as mentioned, but there are numerous authors. Every chapter is different. I'll get to that in a second, but I just wanted to remember that. So another really cool thing that I liked in this book is things are reproduced in terms of primary documents, which I think is really, really cool. I mean, with my academic hat on, most of the time it's great to see these primary documents, like crew reports. There's reproduced German reports of effects of certain raids that some of these individuals were part of. What else did I have written down? So those are really cool. And another part, what I was just talking about, is that family connection is the photos. There are photos connected to each chapter, which I think is great. And the acknowledgments and in the chapters, parts that are written in the footnotes, there's parts talked about how the families help them, which is amazing. I think it's great to put a face to a name. You don't often get that, particularly in larger texts and things that are taking a more general view. You don't get that personal connection in this way, which is why I've really liked these two books, For Who Dared and then Failed to Return. And again, just as an aside, again, Heritage House isn't telling me to say any of this. They just sent me the book, said, here you go, and I do my own thing. So I do like that part, because like I said, I miss that sometimes on what I used to do with just pure academics. So it's really great to get these personal connections. So it's, again, broken into a rough chronology of events, excuse me, with what Bomber Command did, right? So there's the raids over Germany, with the raids to Berlin getting particular focus for its obvious reasons, but also the raids in the Ruhr Valley, right? The industrial heart of the Reich at that time, and how dangerous those raids were, both to Berlin and to the valley itself, the Ruhr Valley. It's very difficult because those were very heavily defended, and a lot of losses took place. Also, for those that probably know this more about than I do, is the Nambusters Raid. I think there's 3 chapters in here on it, if I'm remembering correctly from my quick notes that I put together just a short time ago. They talk about that and the Pathfinders that play a role in this. That raid's been talked about many, 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 many times, right? So it's another insight into this, and something interesting that I thought, and I knew this, but not to what kind of depth. Is the Canadian involvement in the Nambusters Raid, right? I knew there was Canadians there. They talk about the Navigators, and I think it was 1/3 of the Navigators involved in the raid are Canadian, right? That's amazing. That because of the symbolic nature of this raid, the difficulty of pulling this raid off, and how important the navigation was for this, right? Because the one dam, I can't remember which, again, not my specialty, but they had to take certain flight paths and then, pull off quickly and take like a right-hand kind of turn, as they dropped the spinning bombs that they used. Upkeep, I believe, is what they were called, the bombs that spun and then spun backwards so they could hit the dam and explode. So that's a hugely important part of this. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm just going to jump on a comment here. Alex, I don't think so. I don't think that's too many. I mean, that could just be a joke, but I get it. I do. Like I just said, it's fairly well known. It's obviously it captures so much attention. The movie about it is still hugely popular. It's discussed all the time. There's all kinds of stuff online about the Nambusters Raid, television shows, books, all kinds of stuff. And I get that. I do. Also, yeah, again, if you're just joking, you're joking. But seriously, though, I think it's a good personal view of it, right? I think it's a great way to look at it in terms of this. And again, I love that the Canadian, angle is a focus, right? Obviously, I always do love that in terms of these things. And this is one of them. And I think that's great. So another important part, excuse me, of the book is the lead up to Operation Overlord and the landings in Normandy. It's oh, sorry, well, yeah, because again, the delay, but yeah, I agree in a lot of ways. It does, right? Because it's a specialized group that's doing this. That's not what Bomber Command is doing the majority of the time, right? This is hardly what they're ever doing. Attacking dams, I mean, there's all kinds of debate whether it was worth it. Take what that from you will. Destroying a couple of dams and everything. I think they were kind of disappointed with the outcome of it. When I say they, I mean Higher Command, Bomber Command, about what it did. I mean, these resources is an interesting debate to have with these specialized missions. But again, I think it does distort our vision of it. But I don't think that this book and the chapters on Nambusters is part of that same trend. Yes, it's talking about the raid, but it's offering a different, insight into it. And another thing that I think is important about the Nambusters chapter is talking about the role of navigators, like I mentioned, and the important part that they play in these raids, right? And just Bomber Command in general. Very technical part of getting things done. Say it very, very sorry, just reading the comments. It's an important part of that, getting it done. What else was I going to say? Oh, and the Pathfinders, right? Those marking targets it's used in that sense too, about talking about the raid and using that kind of specialty that develops of Pathfinders marking targets and how difficult that is. Yeah, Philip, thanks. That's good. That's funny. I know, who would have thought that, right? It's in the name everywhere. But, well, as some of you do know, I like to, obviously the Canadian angle, but I like to tell as many stories as I can. It doesn't always have to be pure Canadian. If there's a small connection, I do like it. But obviously I have to have a focus. So Canada is that focus for me. But I think that's interesting. So anyway, so going what I was talking about, the lead up to Overlord and the bombing behind the lines, behind the beaches and everything like that. So trying to cut down the communications network. Bridges, rail stations are a big target for Bomber Command. River crossings, all that kind of stuff, trying to hit, staging areas, that kind of thing, and how many there are, those raids, and how early they start, right? They start months in advance, and they continue afterwards as well, right? They still have to try and stop stop the communication networks, right? Because not every German unit that ends up fighting in Normandy is anywhere near Normandy, right? So they have to get there. It's an important part to talk about, and an interesting aside that they talk about is, I think I agree, especially because of the timing of this book when it's written, right, coming after the anniversaries, the big anniversaries, 75th, right, of the Normandy landings, pre-COVID. And more or less the lack of recognition that the Bomber Command, air crews played in Normandy, right? There's lots of commemorations at the beach and everything, all of that. But that said, I think I agree. I mean, the Air Command has, like the RAF, RCAF, and all those, that they have memorials in Normandy. I mean, they're very much off the beaten path. Very much. But I think just generally, as I tend to say, is, in the, popular conscious, I use that term a lot, popular memory of how we remember things. I think that's kind of spot on, in a sense. We're missing that element, right? There's always this claim, and I think it's more of a misunderstanding than an actuality of what happened, is the bombing didn't, work. Right, it didn't take out the targets. It didn't hit the beaches, which is true. I mean, high level bombing is extremely difficult without today's technology, right? Which they did not have. So that's kind of in the popular memory, right? Like all these quotes about the Air Force not doing its job, and even that goes along with the naval bombardment, that kind of thing. But I think behind the lines is just as important, right? To cut off, slow down, take out targets of opportunity, all that kind of thing. Obviously, that's not what Bomber Command's doing with targets of opportunity, but they are part of a plan working towards this. So I think it's a really interesting one, and other things play a role in this. It's probably gonna make some people groan and not like it, but right in the not newish, the Dunkirk movie from Christopher Nolan, right? There's some soldier at one point, like after they get strafed, yelling, "Where's the Air Force?" Blah blah blah. They're inland, right? They're inland, keeping things at bay, right? That's what's happening with Bomber Command, part of Overlord. So I think that's an important part to remember. It's hard to memorialize that in an easily accessible way. I get that too. But I think just for those of you who are really interested, and those watching, right, are really part of this, can help just kind of change those perceptions, bring these things up, keep these things in mind. I think that's a good start. I mean, sorry, we're getting a lot of Nambusters questions, actually. So I'll come back to that in a second. But I just want to say, I think I agree. The comment that's made by the author who's talking, just the first comments on the lead up to Overlord. And I'll come back to Nambusters in a minute. I just want to continue on with the next major chunk, is the attacks that Bomber Command launched on the V1 and V2, the rocket sites. So that's an important part of this book. A number of crews are killed doing so. They are said in, common parlance of the time and in the book, right? They're supposed to be easier raids, right? Where you're not in the heart of Germany, you're hitting the French coast. It's still dangerous, right? There's still anti-aircraft fire that can happen, right? Some of these bombers takes the lucky shot and down they go. You can hit a fuel in the wings or an engine, can catch fire and spread, right? Or you can take out the pilot and remember the crew, right? And that can cause all kinds of chaos. Take off the tail. Any number of these things can happen, right? A little bit of that stuff. So sorry, anyway. So I think that's an important part too. I mean, because obviously these rockets aren't going to win Germany the war, but they still cause a lot of damage and a lot of have a large psychological impact, right? Particularly on those in in Britain at the time, but they also caused havoc later, but also in places like Antwerp. And I think I'm just saying this generally is to remember these things. Remember what these V2 rockets did, the V1 rockets. I know they're not rockets. I'm just using a catch-all. As YouTube people like to point out the minute details. I know they're both not technically rockets. It's just easier to say it that way. But anyway, so the Canadian crews that took part in this and the Canadians who took part of that as well. And again, they move towards the end, just talking about another just kind of general raid that goes and gets a whole crew killed, which is an unfortunate part of this. So I think we got some questions here that I can come back to. This one's a good one. It's about the Nambusters, right? And the raids. It's hard to say, right? I mean, I'm not an expert. I can have my opinions. I don't think it was worth it. Honestly, I don't think it was worth the amount of time and effort and even intellectual power that was put into doing these things, right? The process of developing that bomb I mentioned, upkeep, right? You got to have this spinning bomb that can get over, the nets because it needs to bounce on the water. Sorry, the torpedo nets, so it can get as close as possible to the dam and then explode. I mean, some of them are just impregnable dams because they're earth dams. I don't think so, but that's. Yes, I have the PhD in a military historian, but it's just I'm not. There's people who are experts on the Nambusters Raid. So if that's something you're interested in, check out their work. Lots of talks online by people and from other stuff as well, talking about the Nambusters is a really important one. What else we got here? So from Steve, maybe, I don't know. It sounds like it's hard to say, right? It's difficult in terms of what impact those would even have on certain defenses, right? I think, and me and Alex might disagree on this a little bit, but Dieppe showed that certain planes can't do much damage to certain fortifications, right? I don't know if it would have been worth the risk bringing in these 2-engine bombers to come in low. I just think it would have caused more casualties than unnecessary. Things like that. I think they did the best they could with the bomber command missions. I think, hitting behind the lines is important because timing is an element of the Normandy campaign, right? They're trying to get on land quickly. Obviously, it doesn't work that way, but they still get enough on in time. So again, I don't know. I mean, I've done stuff looking at the armor, the role that the armor plays in getting ashore. It has a bigger role than I think people are aware of. And again, I think popular culture plays a role on this. So maybe, I don't know, again, it's a tough one and not one I've really thought about, but my gut says no, based on what was carried out at Dieppe, what worked, what didn't work at Normandy, and all these things, right? Just because they're there doesn't mean they're not going to work. And I mean, there was air support, close-in air support, right? I've read about many of that, and a lot of it just doesn't work. A lot of it goes wrong. There's a lot of friendly fire on low-flying planes. I mean, I've read one account that a Spitfire flew in front of one of those rocket firing landing ships and just was obliterated, right? So I think that's part of it. Sorry, I'm just reading that. Yeah, this is also true. Yeah, they come in perpendicular to the beaches, which is good. In terms of they use, fly in from the coast based on time to drop their bombs, which again happens throughout the campaign, right? The bombing of Caen, which is not really touched on in this, but it's part of it. Sorry, hold on. I think I skipped one. Sorry, I don't mean to skip your question here, Chris. Just give me a second. Yeah, it does. Not in an in-depth way, right? Because that's not what this book's purpose is. But they talk about the first chapter. If I'm remembering, is the only one? Maybe not. I can't remember. Talks about a crash in Scotland, I believe. Again, I could be misremembering, but it was Scotland. Yeah. So yes, they talk about that, and those who are training get caught in bad weather. Could be malfunctions of the equipment. Could be lack of experience. Right. There's a good number of that happening in training. And I mean, there's losses, right? In training, there's always going to be losses. So there's only one chapter, unfortunately, on that, but there is one. But some other experiences are talked about in here because they took an individual look, right? They follow usually a certain individual of a crew. will be like the central character of a chapter, and then they'll talk about their training experience. Sometimes they're at these training bases, or conversion units as they're called, and losses happen there while they're there, right? Or people that they knew, or instructors that they had or knew, get killed, and they talk about that. So yeah, it is definitely very much part of the book. It's just it only gets one chapter in and of itself. Yeah, sorry, I'm just was in Burma. No, they were not in Burma. No, this is Europe. It's a specialized squadron for these types of specialty type bombing runs. Yeah, so that's an interesting part. I think I've caught up on the questions. I think that's the questions. Yeah. Sorry if I missed it. Please send it again. I will get to it if I can. I should have lots of time. So yeah, please do send it again, and I will double check. Anything on this? Oh, here's another question. Renfrew, I don't think so. I can just quickly check. It's the beauty of a live stream, right? I could check. I don't think so. That name's not ringing any bells. No, it's. Oh, actually, hold on. No, it's a different name. No, unfortunately not. Not that I could see. But yeah, they can only do so much, right? I think if you, I think you're here at the beginning, Chris. I think there's only 16 that are like the pure focus of the book. It's unfortunate, but yeah, they can't do everybody, right? That'd be great, but it's just not possible. So what else did I want to talk about? Okay, so I can do this real quick, and then we can do some more. 2 more sections left, and then questions galore, fire away. So I wanted to start with what I liked. It's an important part of this type of review. I liked that each chapter had a short description at the beginning. Talking like paragraph, giving kind of like an insight of what you're about to read. I really liked that. I mean, I don't often see that. I mean, sometimes there's a paragraph within the chapter, but not always. And I like that because it's kind of telling you what's going to come, right? Because they talk about in the introduction breaking up the book into those areas I just talked about, but also like, is this going to be a story about a whole crew that's killed? There's a story of one where there's one survivor of a whole crew, which is, I mean, the mental weight of that survivor is enormous. Or like talking about like what role that crew was going to play in that operation, like I talked about the Nambusters one, or like give an insight of like what it's like to fly into Berlin, right, when you're on a raid. So I think it's an interesting, and really enjoyed that part of it. I already mentioned also the other part that I really liked. I already mentioned this, but worth mentioning again, especially for getting the book. I do think it is, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I think it's worth it for this, is the photos. Excuse me, the photos in and of itself are amazing. Like you don't normally get this. Like hold on, like it ends each chapter, right? It's just pages. Let's see it real quick of the photographs, right? Say of their graves or of the flyers, right? Which with the technology we have nowadays is easier to share and find. But in terms of a book, right? Like it's great. Like you got crews, you got individuals, you've got sites, memorials. There's photos in here from, like, say that flyer I was talking about, who's the only one to survive. He went back to do the memorial that they put up for the crew in the local people put it up in France, I believe. And it's great to kind of get these photos and understanding who these people are, what they look like. Getting the background on them is part of that as well, right? Because they have to research their families, get in touch, understanding that, getting their records, which they can do because most of them died in service. It's easier to get them. I'm sure that took them some time to get, because they're not easy to get sometimes. Some of them are gone. Oh, I've never heard of that. Sorry, everybody. I'm just reading a comment. I did not. Interesting. I don't know them. Be more interested to find out though, because that sounds very interesting. Yeah, that's really cool, because I think Susan, that I like to look at East Asia, so in Southeast Asia as well. So that's really cool. I'll have to look that up. Maybe after I'll take a look, because I got the holidays coming up, so that's good. So yeah, I think that was really enjoyable. Sorry about the photos. Getting back to that, I really like that. Again, you can ask me if there's other things I might have liked, or things you might expect from a book like this. There's not much I didn't like. I could say all kinds of things. Like the bibliography is actually really good. A lot of up-to-date sources. There are footnotes. There's not many of them. I mean, again, it's not an academic book. I just like footnotes because I just like footnotes, not even in the academic sense. I just like reading. I guess I can't remember. I read this recently somewhere. It's like the gossip of history. It's like the behind the scenes. It's the historiography. I just like that. I just think it's interesting. I just like to read the small details that might not fit in, especially in a narrative like this book. That's just one thing. But again, it's not really a knock against it. It's just something. And again, academically trained, I can't shut my brain off from these things. One thing I didn't like, though, and I don't have any specific off the top of my head because I read this a bit ago and over some time, is some of the chapters are a little short. It doesn't really develop the story much. It feels like kind of cut off. Like it just sort of ends, like they crashed. And I get the limitations of research. I do, particularly during COVID, which is why I mentioned that. I get that. It's just, I mean, I can't love everything about everything, right? So that's just one. Sometimes I'm just like, ooh, I want more. Like, give me more here, or this individual. Like sometimes one individual out of a crew won't be as well researched. Not necessarily a fault of the authors and the editor, but just because of lack of resources or unable to find anything like that. It's just that happens. I get it. I do. It's just, again, that's just something to me. It's just like, but that's not most of them. There's only a couple like that where I was like, oh, I just want to hear more or about this individual or that kind of thing. So that's one that one thing that kind of stuck out to me when I was finished about that is like some of them are just short. Some of them kind of don't seem to sort of just end and don't have a good, flushing out of the story as best as some of the other ones. Because some of the other chapters are so well done and so well researched and told and everything. And some of them just aren't up to that. So I think maybe it's just an internal comparison that sometimes there's nothing you can do about, right? Sorry, I'm just reading this latest comment here. Yeah, I have heard that in the past, Steve. I have. I mean, the ball bearings factories are targeted. I know they are from what they can give from intelligence, right? But again, like I said earlier, the bombing is very difficult to do. There's this still somehow understanding of that the bombing could have been better in the sense of better targeted. It's just not possible, right? It gets better, but it's by the end of the war, but it's still not good. They're still missing targets, but I think one of the studies by miles, like that's not good, right? That's why they target areas, right? Areas of cities and all that kind of stuff. So they're trying to just hit what they can with as much intelligence as they have, which is fairly good. From my understanding as a Air Force specialist. But one person who is learning more. It's just, I think that's an interesting part of that is you can target all you want, right? Like the bridges and everything. There's arguments about hitting, railway tracks. I mean, they barely could hit a neighborhood sometimes, let alone a single railway track. It's just, it's not possible from what Bomber Command does. Yes, Bomber Command isn't just the 4-engine heavy planes. I understand that, but that's the majority of what they do. So I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, yes. But again, you have to remember technical limitations, and also they're getting shot at, which is part of this. I mean, a good chunk of this book talks about that, right? And why another reason, I guess, to add this to the why I liked it, right, is the insights, right, from some of the crew, from the reports that they wrote afterwards, the debriefings, bringing this, remembrances later on, right, about like a lot of the accounts, there's like this visceral reading, right, like of getting attacked in the dark by a dual engine night fighter coming kind of out of nowhere sometimes, right? And talking about I forget the name of it. I'm sure somebody here knows what it is, and my German is non-existent. But the cannon that was pointing 90 degrees up, right? So they could fly under the plane without them even noticing, and then fire around into them. And then that's how they would take out the heavier bombers in a lot of cases. And that's just terrifying, right? All of a sudden the plane's on fire or is hit by a shell and you have no idea where or how. So again, that is something to keep in mind too, especially when you're trying to do level flight, which the book talks about, is dangerous, right? Because that leaves you vulnerable to ground fire, to fighter planes, all that stuff. So it's an important part of it. And then also they talk about like things like evasive maneuvers and things they're doing in the planes and everything. It's just, to me, it's like I've read this before in different ways, but it's just crazy, right? Just the things that they had to do to survive in so many circumstances. It's really, really interesting. Oh yeah, this is a good one here. Yes, it's yeah. When I say like cutting communications, like that's a general kind of catch-all military phrase, right? Cutting lines of communication. Yeah, it's about limiting their ability to do. Um, uh, sorry, Alex. I'll come back in a second. Just he says he's got to run, so you're welcome. There's lots to talk about, as there always is. My gut says yes, I would buy this book. If someone told me about this book, I would buy it because I'm just interested in the personal, right? I know a lot of people watching this are interested in the personal. I would buy it. I have some links. I have the links below. They do help me out, but if you can't do it through there, that's not the best for you. Just I would still suggest buying it. This isn't just out of personal interest. I would suggest buying the book because I really was enthralled with the book. Like sometimes I would get so into it, I'd forget what time it is or all that kind of stuff. I just get lost in stories, which I like, and particularly the history stories, which I'm sure another shock for Philip, though, is not surprising, given my interests and everything I do. Yeah, so sorry, go back to Alex's comment to let Steve jump off with getting an answer to his question. Yeah, you're right, hitting the martial areas, and that's one of the things they talk about in that section on the lead up to Overlord is hitting the marshalling areas and the marshalling yards, trying to take out the rolling stock and all of that, particularly because that's how they would transport a lot of the divisions, right? Particularly the armored divisions, and they knew that that's what they would do. So they tried to hinder their movements as much as possible by doing so. And it's a good way to also track what you've done, right? Because you can sort of count because they are photographing while they're bombing, right? So it can do these kinds of things. But again, Alex is right. It's a good way to think about it and all of that. So there's lots going on there. So I think that was really it for the like and don't like. Lots to like. Lots of stories getting really lost in them. Not much to dislike in this one, to be honest. It's just a good narrative driven story. And their goal is just to have these stories remembered. And that's what they do. And I think they do it very, very well, and it's great to see. Again, because I talk about this all the time, just telling the stories, keeping these things going, is an end in of itself. So I think that's good. So there's a few things within the book itself that I think were just interesting and worth talking about, especially if you want to ask some questions while I'm telling this or something before we end. Ask away again, or just even general. Doesn't even have to be about the book, Air Force, whatever. You can talk. I got nowhere to go. So one thing that was really interesting at the beginning is kind of like the stories around how the Royal Canadian Air Force was able to equip itself in times of war, right? Being right next to the United States and all the industrial power that it had at the time, right? There was U.S. neutrality laws preventing delivering of supplies to a nation at war, which of course they ease over time, lending to, when that goes to things like Lend-Lease, where they're just literally giving them, the Allies everything that they need. So there's that. So that's really cool. But one of the stories, and I've heard this before, but this one gives the details. It's great for what they do. So I've heard like they push planes across the border. Well, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I like to picture these things. And they do that for you in this story. They're talking about how there's an airfield on the Montana-Alberta border that literally runs on the border. One half is in the United States, the other half is Canada. So it's a old dirt runway. So what they would do is the Americans would fly it to this runway, bring it and land on their side of it, and then they would just come and push the plane over to the Canadian side of the runway, and then they'd fly off from there where they needed to go. So they're not technically flying to Canada. That was under the law. You can't fly these planes to a belligerent at war. They weren't flying it. They got around it that way because they made a huge, Canada made a huge purchase order before technically declaring war. So all of them were ready. So that they had to do things like this. To me, that's ingenious, but it's also showing what it was like early in the war for Canada, right? Because Canada, again, you can argue about this till the end of times, but was Canada ready for the war? Who made mistakes? How did they go about doing it? This is just one way of kind of talking about how the Air Force supplied itself. Yeah, this is an aside, but it's a great point from Alex again, with his experience and background and work he knows, which is all great. The Air Force, I do agree. I think it lends itself to these stories, right? Because we have a built-in narrative to begin with, right? Especially with a raid. Um, like you have a beginning, middle, and an end, literally, right? Like that literally takes place every day when they're running their raids or running, the flights. It's interesting. I mean, the Navy's got a little bit of that too, right, with convoy duty and that kind of thing, which I've seen some of that too. Not like these books. I mean, that would be cool if there are out there. You can leave a comment below if you've seen anything like that takes a naval kind of perspective like this. I'd be really interested in to read those because I think that's really cool. But yeah, the Army, it's more difficult, right? There's a beginning. It's hard to tell where the middle is, and then there's an end. That's the end of the war, or also things that happen, casualties, getting killed, that kind of thing. But these are much more self-contained stories, which I think is a great way to think about it. This is a good question. This is another thing I wrote down. A good question, Ian. Thank you for sharing that one. Is they talk about the different planes, right? Because they're not all given the shiny new plane when they're first learning, right? They have planes designed for training that are, ubiquitous with the training plan that were all over the country. Some of them still exist today, pockets across the country. That bright yellow is kind of like an iconic part of this air training plan. But they talk about that, getting the older planes that they're learning to fly on, particularly the 4 engines, the 2 engines, that kind of thing. One that sticks out to me is there is a disparaging of the Halifax by one Canadian. I can't remember if he was a mid gunner. He was an aircrew. I can't remember exactly. I don't think he was a pilot. But he's disparaging the Halifax to his family in his letters home. He doesn't like the Halifax. He says so to his family. I guess the censors let that through, I guess, which is interesting. He's talking about how he loves the Lancaster and that he's proud to be a Lancaster crew. It's funny. I mean, yeah, there is a little bit of anger about that, but I've also read that some crews prefer the Halifax because they were easier to get out of, right? If you had to bail out, the Halifax was wider in the body. It's easier to get out than the Lancaster was, which, I mean, with the high casualty rates that Bomber Command suffers is going to be something on your mind. So that's interesting. Yeah, sorry, there's another question here. No, not really. I mean, it's mentioned a little bit about like flying correct paths and all that kind of thing. There's sometimes issues with navigation where they just come off the bomber stream and are on their own. That leads to one of the planes getting shot down in like northern Denmark, where they're not actually near for the raid. But again, I don't want to give it away because it's a really interesting story. But yeah, they talk about the different technologies that are used to locate targets. Like I mentioned, the pathfinders, the marking of targets over, with flares, that kind of thing. But not so much that. It's like a personal view of like you feel like in a lot of ways you're in the plane while these things are happening. So there's a little talk of the technical stuff here and there on the sides, that kind of thing. But again, it's mostly focused on the experience of these air crew and what they're going through. But it's definitely part of it, and it's really interesting. So what was the last one? Oh, yeah, one of the stories I did want to talk about, which I think is one of the hardest hitting stories of it all. But this aviator's experience encapsulates so much about the Second World War, and not just about the Canadian experience of the Second World War. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. I'm not good unless I've heard the name before. His name was Teddy Blenkinsop, I think is how it's pronounced. It's in the book. He's mentioned throughout the book. He has his own focus. Anyway, so he was kind of following the traditional path at first. He was just really good when he was getting trained. So those, especially early on in the war, who were really good and stood out, were kept aside to train the next crews coming up, right? And some men who went through the program were very upset about this. They didn't sign up to train other people. They wanted to fight. So he gets a sense that he was one of those characters. He wants to join air crew in combat. But which is really interesting is he's actually sent to New Zealand to help, the Royal New Zealand Air Force better their training. Like he was just that good with what he did. He was able to do that. I can't remember if he was a pilot or not. Either way, if you read the book, you'll know who I'm talking about here. But anyway, so he's just that good. He's literally sent across the Pacific Ocean to help train. Then he comes back. He's sent to North Africa for a very short period, serving in one of the squadrons there. Does some bombing of Italy. Then he's sent to Britain. Serves again back to that more traditional story of the RCAF and Bomber Command and all of that. And then he's shot down. He tries to evade capture, and he does for quite some time. It's one of those, loose lips sinks ships kind of situation. Some kid talks about it to someone at school. Someone's listening. How his family is hiding this Canadian or just this Allied aviator, and the SS come through and get him. And then he's thrown into. Again, I'm not sure what the correct terminology is, but he's put into the concentration camp system because the SS was told he took part in a partisan attack on a target. But he technically wasn't even part of it. He just watched the attack. But that was enough. So unfortunately, he dies in Bergen-Belsen of what they say is heart failure. But the book notes that was usually because of a lethal injection. So that's just one of the many sad stories of this book. There's a lot of them. But yeah. So that's my real talking points. So if there's any more questions, you can take the time now. I do recommend it. Like I said, there's links to buy it below. You can help me out by doing so. If you are interested in buying it through those links, helps me out. I get a little bit, keep helping me do what I do. I hope you enjoy these reviews. They're a little different. I like the interaction, as I've said many times before, getting questions, new things to think about. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I do suggest you read it, get it how you can. If you could help me out again, that would be amazing. If not, that's okay. Still get it in library or whatever. It's fairly new, so I don't know how available it is yet. It's available for purchase. I don't know if it's in libraries and things like that. Probably. I mean, especially with the holidays coming up, it's a good time to read, right? Some time off. So that said, thanks for watching. If you enjoy the channel, watching now live or later on, and you haven't done yet, so please subscribe. It helps me out. The number of subscribers I have helps my content reach more people, which helps the stories reach more people. And that's just how YouTube works, right? The more who seem to watch. Seems to help and get this turned out. Yeah, so sorry, I was usually doing my wrap up, but again with the delay. Yeah, it's just it's good. His story, like I was just mentioning, sorry, the Belkin ship slop story. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Yeah, I mean it happens a lot. There's other flyers that are killed in other concentration camps. For whatever reason, again, the Nazis just had murder and as they're one of their main tenets of their regime. Anyway, so that being said, also if you like the work that I do, you can become a patron. You get lots of benefits to doing so. You get inside information. You get early access to the videos I make, information earlier than most people. I do polls and everything where you can influence what work I do, and there's all kinds of chats on there, and there's a great growing community that are supporting me. So every supporter helps me through Patreon. It's only a couple bucks a month, and you get these access to this stuff. The more you give, the more you get. So if you haven't yet, becoming a patron would really, really help me, and I need more to kind of keep going into the new year. I'm set up to do pretty well into the new year, but to get really solid, more patrons would be great. There's links below. Sorry, I'm getting itchy because of the dry air. Up here in Ottawa, it gets chilly. Anyway, so yeah, if you become a patron, that'd be great. I know a good chunk of you watching are, especially live. If you don't want to do that, you can do one time through Buy Me a Coffee, links down below. And again, thanks for watching, everyone. I always enjoy doing these things live, getting to interact with everybody. So thanks again for coming out and watching. Oh yeah, so coming up, this is the last for 2021. Holidays start for me in a couple of days, so I'm going to be taking time off for that because I think I need some time off. But there's lots coming in January, like pretty much right off the beginning. I think the first is on the first live streams on the 4th. Anyway, there'll be promotion about that. So keep an eye out, but there's lots of interesting things coming, a wide variety of topics going back to things like commemoration and battlefield tours. There's going to be more just general stories about, say, I've got something lined up for the Air Force, Something else really lined up cool about Swedes serving in Canadian service, which I think is amazing. And then a big one coming at the end of January that I will leave as a bit of a teaser that I think is going to be a good one. So everyone, again, thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe, like the video as well, and leave some comments down below as well. It helps me out, other than the sidebar. And with that, everyone have a good holidays. Christmas in a couple of days, so everyone enjoy your holidays and some time off. Hope you get to relax a little bit and read some history and maybe watch some of my older videos. That'd be appreciated as well. So everyone have a good day, and I will talk to you in the new year.